Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at doingsofdoyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 45. This episode we take a look at what is believed to be the first story Conan Doyle submitted to a publisher, the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, from circa 1877. And here's Paul to set the scene.
Following a particularly atrocious multiple murder in the mid-eighteenth century, Goresthorpe Grange in Norfolk has stood empty and uninhabited for a century, especially given the additional stories of vengeful ghosts who can drive the inquisitive over the brink of insanity. Yet Tom Holton, a friend of the estate's young heir, has his own theories about the supernatural and wishes to test them by spending a night in the Haunted Grange. At first his friend demurs, but is soon caught up in Tom's enthusiasm, and together the two young men submit themselves to a terrifying ordeal.
The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe is believed to be the earliest surviving story that Conan Doyle submitted to a publisher, but we actually know very little to date when it was written. It certainly feels earlier than The Mystery of Sasassa Valley, Conan Doyle's first published work, which appeared in Chambers' Edinburgh Journal in September 1879, and which we covered back in episode 29. Stylistically, there are many similarities between the two stories, not least the reuse of the names Tom and Jack for the principal characters. But Haunted Grange is a more naive and less assured work and certainly feels like early apprentice work. From internal references within the story, Owen Dudley Edwards has suggested that it was probably written around 1877 or 1878, when Conan Doyle was 18 years old and a medical student in Edinburgh. In fact, Edwards puts his own detective skills to work, observing that the manuscript is on the sort of paper issued for lecture notes or possibly for a clerk, and connects this to Conan Doyle being clerk to Joseph Bell in 1878-79. Now, even if that's perhaps a little fanciful, there's little reason to doubt that the story was written in the early years of Conan Doyle's medical studies. Conan Doyle then submitted the story to Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine sometime before 1880, as has been confirmed by the archive records, but it was rejected and it never saw print. Now, unusually, the manuscript was not returned to the author, as was typically the case, and instead it languished in the Blackwood archives for decades. We can speculate on why this should be the case, but Occam's razor would suggest a mistake rather than any particular special reason. For his part, Conan Doyle believed that the manuscript had been destroyed, and in March 1882, when he submitted another short story to Blackwood's, this one entitled The Actor's Duel, he wrote in the covering letter, "I once before trespassed upon your valuable time by sending up a sketch which did not come up to your standard. I trust this may meet with a better fate. Will you do me the favour not to destroy the manuscript in case of rejection?" And again, almost 10 years later, when he submitted Uncle Jeremy's Household to Blackwood's, Conan Doyle referenced that he had previously lost a manuscript he'd sent to them. Now, unfortunately, no correspondence accompanies the manuscript of Haunted Grange, and so at that point, the trail runs cold. But we leap forward then 60 years or so to 1942, when the manuscript was transferred to the National Library of Scotland, along with the Blackwood family and business papers. And there it seems to have lain largely unnoticed until the 1980s, when it was referenced in the Gibson and Green bibliography of Conan Doyle's works. And then in 2000, the Arthur Conan Doyle Society, the predecessor of the present ACD Society, published Haunted Grange for the first time, with an expansive introduction by Owen Dudley Edwards and a preface by Ian McGowan from the National Library of Scotland. And very recently, Haunted Grange has been republished in 2 anthology volumes, Ghosts from the Library, edited by Tony Medawar, and in Southsea Stories and Beyond, edited by Matt Wingett. But beyond this relatively modest circulation, it has been largely ignored and unstudied, although you can read it for yourself at the ever-wonderful Arthur Conan Doyle Encyclopedia, and we'll put a link to the text in the show notes. And for Conan Doyle as a Edinburgh lad, I would have thought it made perfect sense that he would be submitting this first story of his to one of the two great Edinburgh journals.
Yeah, Blackwood's magazine was one of the almost intellectual foundations of Edinburgh. Several of the great literary names of this period had found their way into it. James Hogg, George Eliot, Anthony Trollope, all these great names, and Blackwood's had a real standing. I mean, so much so that one of Doyle's great heroes, Edgar Allan Poe, across the Atlantic, was able to write a spoof story, which we'll discuss later, how to write a Blackwood's article.
Yeah.
But Doyle was very focused on this particular magazine for a long time. It was if he'd been able to get himself in that as his first publication, the prestige would have been enormous. But as we know, obviously, this story was sent off to Blackwood's, and well, it wasn't even formally rejected. As we'd say, it just disappeared into the archives. And one of the speculations is that he might not even have put a return address.
Yes.
He kept trying, as you've said, to get into Blackwood's, but there was only one story he ever actually got published in the magazine, which was A Physiologist's Wife. His actual first published story he submitted to Chambers, Blackwood's great Edinburgh rival, and that ended up being his first publication. Chambers was still regarded with a degree of fondness by people, but it didn't quite have the prestige of Blackwood's. So Doyle didn't quite get that launch, but getting into Chambers was enough to give him a bit of a kickstart, and his real kickstart came when he got into one of the other great literary magazines, the Cornhill.
Yes.
With J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's this prestige thing with Blackwood's, and also he's still living in Edinburgh at this time.
Yes.
Almost, this is one way of getting on in Edinburgh society as well. To if he'd been able to get himself into Blackwood's, it would have given him a degree of local standing as a writer, as well as the national and international implications of appearing in it.
Yeah. And Owen Dudley Edwards, in that 2000 volume that we mentioned earlier, has a good quote about Blackwood's and Chambers. Says, Blackwood's compelled the respect of Edinburgh and the cultured world, where, say, Chambers' Edinburgh magazine was simply publication. I think also there's this kind of personal or family connection as well. The background to the magazine is that it was founded by William Blackwood and Sons in 1804, and it was initially a bookseller's, but it was also the Scottish regional agent for London literary publishers like John Murray. And after 1817, when Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine first appeared, members of the family started to travel backwards and forwards to London, so they started to become a part of that same kind of literary set. And from there, you get some connection. So John Blackwood, who was the principal editor from about 45 to, well, he died in 1879. He was friendly with Dickie Doyle, we believe, with Richard Doyle. And John Blackwood was also friendly with Thackeray. And it's as a result of the friendship with Thackeray that Thackeray came to Edinburgh in 1856. And you get that wonderful story that is passed down through the Doyle family of the young Arthur, supposedly, dandled on Thackeray's knee, when in fact it wasn't Arthur, it was probably Annette. But there's another connection in that John Blackwood was close friends with John Hill Burton, the historiographer royal of Scotland and noted book hunter. And the Burtons had put up Conan Doyle, with or without his parents, we're not entirely sure, in the early 1860s when the Doyles had hit upon hard times. And at that time, Conan Doyle was living at Liberton Bank House with Burton's sister Mary and his son William, or Willie Burton, who was a longtime friend of his, would eventually go to Japan, and we talked about him in connection with Jellen's voyage on episode 20. And ultimately, Conan Doyle would dedicate the firm of Girdleston to his good friend Willie Burton as well. So there's always been the suggestion that there's a connection from John Hill Burton as a possible promoter of the young Conan Doyle to John Blackwood.
Yeah, so given those literary connections, you can see almost why Doyle is sort of setting his hat at getting into Blackwoods. It's quite strange in many ways, though, with Blackwoods magazine, because, as we've said, it has this higher literary standing than Chambers's journal. But at the same time, Blackwoods is also well known for gothic and sensational stories, which we usually look down on in this era. But for some reason, Blackwoods seems to have this prestige, and even getting these sort of stories into Blackwoods is prestigious. And this is sort of what Edgar Allan Poe is pointing at, with his spoof essay, How to Write a Blackwood Article, which first appeared in the American Museum in 1838. And in this, you have a rather unhinged female writer, Zenobia Psyche, who also known as Suki Snobs, who wants to get an article into Blackwoods, and has a long discussion with the editor, and he's explaining the particular scrapes that her character could get into, involving the usual burial alive, being caught up in a bell or an oven. And it's the usual sort of Poe pushing his humour that bit too much. It doesn't quite hang together, but it is interesting that at that point Blackwoods has obviously got this reputation.
Yes.
I don't actually know if Poe himself tried to submit.
Well, you would suspect. I mean, it has the mark of somebody who maybe had been rejected.
Yeah, and he spent part of his formative years in Scotland. So he would probably be familiar with the prestige of Blackwoods from then.
Yes.
But this also, then, with this sort of story being seen as Blackwood's fare, would possibly also explain why Conan Doyle would push this ghost story towards Blackwoods, thinking, this will fit nicely. And obviously it either got lost or the editor just didn't agree.
Yeah. And one does wonder if Conan Doyle took it particularly personally that he didn't get into Blackwoods with the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe. He actually tried, I think it's 8 or 9 times to get into Blackwoods. And as was the case in those days, he started quite high up the food chain with Blackwoods, and then eventually the stories might be accepted lower down, and you got stories like Uncle Jeremy's Household appearing in the Boy's Own paper. One of his great Gothic short stories, The Surgeon of Gaster Fell, was submitted to Blackwoods and rejected, and also picked up by Chambers instead. But as you said, he managed to get in with a physiologist's wife, finally breached the stout Scottish barrier of Blackwoods with that story. But then the boot was then on the other foot. By then, Conan Doyle was becoming, an important new writer. And William Blackwood III expressed interest in 1890 in publishing The White Company, only to discover that it had been taken by the Cornhill, who serialized it throughout 1891. And it does feel almost a little petulant on Conan Doyle's part that actually at the moment in which Blackwoods come knocking, he turns around and says, sorry, you can't have it. It's gone somewhere else.
And you've also got at this period, and particularly the 1880s, 1890s, a growth in more of these sort of publishers. Blackwoods was facing greater competition.
Yeah, good point.
From new London publishers who were able to offer greater rewards at times.
So let's delve a little bit deeper into this ghost story that Conan Doyle submitted to Blackwoods, and it has a kind of naive charm to it. but one of the most abiding characteristics of it is that it has this kind of almost campfire storytelling style to it.
Yeah, I mean, if you just look at the opening paragraphs, you straight away in that sort of tradition. Looking back now at the events of my life, that one dreadful night looms out like some great landmark. Even now, after the lapse of so many years, I cannot think of it without a shudder. All minor incidents and events I mentally classify as occurring before or after the time when I saw a ghost. Yes, saw a ghost. Don't be incredulous, reader. Don't sneer at the phrase. Though I can't blame you, for I was incredulous enough myself once. However, hear the facts of my story before you pass a judgment. It's classic round the fire stuff,
Yeah.
and the fact that he's addressing the reader direct. There's a definite, as you've said before, this is Prentice work.
Yes.
There's a naivety to it. It's something he would actually often stay with, but develop. So you've got Micah Clarke
Mm.
is set in the a long time ago storytelling
Mm.
thing, and of course the Brigadier Gerard
Yes,
stories are the
absolutely.
brigadier in a cafe recounting his stories. But Doyle very quickly learns sophistication
Mm.
with how to do this sort of writing. Here, it's it's just
It's
there is
clunky.
that it's very clunky, very much like the work of a trainee writer,
Yeah.
and also harks back to the days he talks about in Memories and Adventures at Stonyhurst,
Yes. Yeah.
when he would actually tell stories to his fellow pupils and break off at the classic cliffhanger moment and demand payment down in buns or tarts or whatever it may be, until before they hear the next episode. I mean, he would stick with that as well.
Yes.
The classic example, of course, is Mr. Holmes. They were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
Yes.
Tune in for next week. It's that kind of thing, but in this story, you're getting the beginnings of it, and
Yes.
he, he would probably have been very pleased himself that it just sat in the archives.
Oh, I should think so.
And he'd be probably quite horrified that in the 2000s it's back in print. But it is absolutely fascinating to see the development of his style, and also his own, at this point, lack of a degree of self-criticism to
Yeah.
think that this is worthy of going into Blackwoods.
Yeah, it's quite a claim, isn't it, when you look at what else is in Blackwoods at the time. I mean, the other thing I'd say is that, to your point about this being, you know, early work and him quickly developing his style,
Mm,
Owen Dudley Edwards makes a really good point that if you compare the opening paragraph of The Mystery of Sasassa Valley
mm,
to the opening paragraph of Haunted Grange, you've already seen a leap forward. So
mm,
in Haunted Grange, the narrator basically says, "I've seen a ghost. I'm going to tell you about when I
mm,
saw a ghost." And in Sasassa Valley, it's more something strange happened to me, and I don't quite know what it was, but I'm going to recount it to you.
mm,
And he's already spinning up the mystery. He's not giving away what is entirely going to happen.
mm.
There's a bit more of a maturity even then, and that could be maybe less than 12 months after he wrote this.
Yeah, he'd have been far better off with this one. I think I saw, or
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
just that little twist would have
Exactly.
just made it that bit a bit less campfire.
Yes. And
Mm,
the other thing that uh, Owen Dudley Edwards points out in his introduction is the characters of the narrator and one of the protagonists there of Tom and Jack. And as I said at the beginning, Tom and Jack are the names also of the characters in Sasassa Valley.
mm,
Edwards talks about them being almost Holmes and Watson prototypes, but not in the sense of them being, a detective and, and,
mm,
and his assistant, but that kind of bond of friendship,
mm,
um, and the kind of different types of the two characters who are in tension against each other. There's a very
mm,
explicit tension here actually, which is really interesting, which is the fact that you've got Tom is said to have a German education,
Mhm.
which makes him naturally more inclined to the sort of romantic, I think.
Mm.
The romantic and the imaginative. Whereas Jack, the narrator, is described by Tom as one of these credo quad tango medicals who walk in the narrow path of certain fact. So you get this nice tension between the two. But similarly, you get Tom as he's musing on his problems is puffing on a long briar root pipe, and the description is he was surrounded by a dense wreath of smoke, from the midst of which his voice issued like the oracle of Delphi, while his stalwart figure loomed through the haze, which is pretty nice stuff for a newcomer.
Oh, absolutely, and it's prefiguring another more famous character Conan Doyle was to come up with not too long afterwards.
Indeed.
And you've also got in this something which again will continue actually throughout Doyle's fiction is self-identification.
Yes.
And you've got these two characters, but they are also both aspects of Doyle himself.
Yeah, very much
So you've
so.
got the medical student side, the empiricist, but then you've got you say the German educated romantic side, and of course Doyle himself had been to Feldkirch not long
Hmm.
before this, and imbued himself with a certain degree of German language and culture. So he's doing that thing which all authors do, is digging from within himself
Yes.
to create his characters. But he would carry on doing this. He would throughout his career, and it's a way of spinning out his own inner dilemmas, really,
Yeah.
and letting the characters wrestle with these issues.
Yes, and there's a very telling line on that actually at one point where Tom's only fault was that he had acquired a strange speculative way of thinking from his German education, and this led to continual arguments between us. For I had been trained as a medical student and looked at things therefore from an eminently practical point of view.
Mm.
And that really does sound like actually left brain, right brain.
Yes, yeah.
It's that kind of tension, isn't it?
Mm, mm,
The other thing that's quite interesting about the story is that it's not set in the present day, even though
mm,
that sort of tension between the romantic and the medical,
mm,
it feels like it should be coming out of the 1870s, 80s. He actually sets this story in the 1840s.
mm.
And I wonder if that's a kind of unconscious nod to the sort of fiction that was influencing the likes of Poe and Bulwer Lytton, as we'll come on to in a bit.
Yeah, he's in a way prefiguring what M.R. James would later suggest as the ideal period in which to set a ghost story, which is some 30 years or so in the past. So
Yes,
it's near enough for
it
people to be
is.
able to identify with the period, but also far enough away for it to already start to be the past, and
Mm.
and and it the ghost or the origins of the ghost can lie there. Although the origins of this ghost lie a century before the story's set, and even this is interestingly prefigurative, because you've got the time of the murder, which
Mm.
is the origins of the ghost in this. It's set in the 45,
Mm.
and we get the mention of the murderer sort of got away with it because the country's attention was focused on Bonnie Prince Charlie's
Yes.
march on London. So you've got this event happening to the background of great events in the country. You get this later with the origin story of the Hand of the Baskervilles,
Yes, you
which
do.
is set at the time of the English Civil Wars in the 1640s.
Yeah.
And
I
so
mean,
there's this minor tragedy is played out in the background of the national tragedy.
yeah, absolutely. You get,
Mm,
in fact, the line. As soon as I read it, I thought, "Oh my goodness, there's Sir Hugo."
mm,
The line is the last tenant, as I discovered from my family papers, was a certain Godfrey Marsden, a villain of the first water. He lived there about the middle of last century and was a byword of ferocity and brutality throughout the whole countryside. Finally, he consummated his many crimes by horribly hacking his two young children to death and strangling their mother. the Sir Hugo stuff is so much more subtle
Yes.
than this, which does have a tendency to go for the jugular,
Mm.
really.
Yeah, it's with all this use of legendary and these sort of elements in these stories. It's perhaps worthwhile to speculate upon why he chose a ghost story
Hmm.
as his first story to submit. I mean, we know he was interested in a number of different genres. You got the ghost story, adventure story, the crime story.
Mhm.
These are all in the air very much at the time, but he's obviously chosen a ghost story specifically as his first submission. Um, in a way, I wonder if it's because you can always feel safe with a ghost story. And
Yes.
audiences are always going to enjoy a good ghost story, but that's the thing, a good ghost story. And translating the ghost story from this sort of format that he's used, the kind of campfire
Mm,
version, the
mm.
oral tradition version, into something rather more sophisticated, which is more what Blackwoods is doing with their stories. This is where the leap is going to have to happen. And
Yes.
just choosing a ghost story because ghost stories, kind of make good copy, isn't quite enough. So you've got this going on, and you can see from the stories he's then producing subsequently. He does a whole string of stories along the adventure Bret Hart sort of lines.
Yes.
But his first published story, Sasassa Valley, is actually a mix,
Yes, it is.
adventure story and a kind of ghost story.
Yeah.
So he'd learned his lessons, and also he after this, you he might have gone back to some of his influences to study more closely.
Mm.
And you can see with this story, probably one of the big influences is Bulwer Lytton's The Haunted and the Haunters,
Mm.
or The
Mm.
House and the Brain,
Yeah.
which was probably the great Victorian ghost story. It very much provided a blueprint
Yes.
for a lot of what came afterwards, and interestingly was published in Blackwoods in 1859, the year of Doyle's birth. So it's all very fitting.
Yeah.
But that has the classic setup of the haunted house and the investigators.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
in it, you've got a house in Oxford Street area.
Yeah.
Has this reputation of being haunted. The narrator, oh, I'd like to go and investigate that. Gets
Yes.
his manservant, who has investigated haunted houses in Germany with him,
Yes. Yeah.
joins in, and they have a night where all sorts of
Mm.
weird and terrifying things happen.
Mm.
I mean, the house itself may have been based on the story of Number 50 Berkeley Square,
Yes.
which was one of the most famous Victorian haunted houses.
Yeah.
Numerous legends surround it. I think there's a story of two sailors spent the night there, and one dies, one goes mad.
Yes.
Or there's a family takes it over, and the maid goes off into a room, and she comes back stark, staring mad, and
Yes. Yes.
dies the next day. All these classic elements of the ghost story are in this reworked in Bulwer Lytton's
Mm.
story, and it is a huge influence. And Doyle himself, in Through the Magic Door, in 1907, would describe it as the very best ghost story I know.
Mm.
So he was certainly familiar with it,
Mm.
but he hadn't quite learned how to put the elements
No.
together.
No. I mean, and Haunted and the Haunters itself is quite a rich meal, isn't it? I mean,
Mm,
there are a lot of incidents in it, but there are also some very big connections between that story and Haunted Grange. You can sort of
mm,
see the echoes of it. There's this mysterious death of a dog in both of
yes.
them.
Mm,
Superficial level, you've got this kind of thing going on as well. But you also get obviously this idea that the last tenant was brutally murdered
mm,
in the same location as well. but you've also got that kind of that setup right at the beginning about I'm going to recount a recent experience.
Mm,
So I think you're probably onto something in that he probably goes for the ghost story as his first submission because there are certain rules around ghost stories,
mm.
and Haunted and the Haunters is one of those ones that sort of already is taking it to 11. Um,
Yeah, and it's also it's a strange story in that it's often been published in two different forms.
mm,
In that there is, in its full version, an epilogue in which a lot of what goes on in the house are explained when the narrator meets a
yes,
mysterious Rosicrucian in London, and then a lot of what goes on is explained. Sometimes because this is overly occult
yes,
in its explanation, it's sometimes omitted, and the story ends just with the haunted house story.
yes,
But this was again, Bulwer Lytton was hugely interested in occultism and Rosicrucianism himself, and did other works that are even more occult, thinking of things like Zanoni and A Strange Story.
yes, yeah,
Um, Bulwer Lytton was often open to being spoofed
yes,
very easily, but all this was in the air, and we know, young Doyle was very interested in this field. And again, there's something experimental going on with the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe. He's working his way through.
yes. I I think the Haunted and the Haunters has quite a profound influence on Conan Doyle as well. In that
Mm, mm,
there are some things that sort of go into his psyche. I think in Haunted and Haunters you have this whole idea about the narrator, who is this hardened rationalist, but he is
mm,
comfortable with the idea that there are things in nature that are not understood.
mm,
There's actually a terrific quote in the story, which is, now my theory is that the supernatural is the impossible, and that what is called supernatural is only a something in the laws of nature of which we have been hitherto ignorant.
mm,
Therefore, if a ghost rise before me, I have not the right to say, so then the supernatural is possible, but rather, so then the apparition of a ghost is contrary to received opinion
mm,
within the laws of nature, that is, not supernatural.
mm,
And there's another in there, which is this idea of the medium being an instrument. Still, there must be found a medium or living being with constitutional peculiarities capable of obtaining these signs, and a few references there as well to mesmerism and spiritualism.
mm,
But this, there is something in this whole idea about the supernatural is merely something that is not yet understood.
mm.
That actually is hardwired into Conan Doyle all the way through his work.
And it's almost what you've just described there, or just quoted there. It's almost like the supernatural equivalent of when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever
Yes,
remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
absolutely.
You're definitely going along those lines, and this is something, as you say, he will explore throughout. But in this particular story, you've got these interesting ideas going on, but they're not developed
Yes.
in any real sense. And we've also gotten, and this unfortunately is another element, I think, of the influence of Bulwer Lytton, is some of the more cliched
Yes.
tropes and language around. I mean, the haunted grange itself is described at one point. There it stood, cold, bleak, and desolate as ever, with the wind howling past it. Great strips of ivy, which had lost their hold upon the walls, swayed and tossed in the wind like the plumes of a hearse. It's very, very cliche, and he later on drop
Yes.
that sort of style, and I don't think in this story that is spoofing.
No, it's
I
not
think it's
spoofing.
there. He thinks it is heightening the atmosphere, and you've got it is very much that Bulwer Lytton. It was a dark and stormy night.
Yes.
That's what you've got going on here. So the actual, when they're in the house, there's a storm at its height. You've got lightning lighting it all up. It's all the classic
Yes.
stage tricks, which have to be handled very carefully,
Well, yes, I
or
mean,
they
there's
land with a resounding clang.
yeah, there was one that particularly made me laugh when I read it again, which is when they take a piece of wallpaper and find that there's blood dripping down the
Mm,
wall, and
yes.
the narrator says, "Great heavens! It was all freckled and spotted with gouts
Mm.
of still
Mm.
liquid blood.
Mm.
Even as we stood gazing at it, another drop fell upon the
Yes.
floor with a dull splash. But you know what? The strange thing about it is that for all you have got these sort of moments of sort of unalloyed pleasure in writing these horrible moments, there are some moments of subtlety in it. The bit I quite like is there's a description of the passageway.
Mm.
It's facing the outside of the building, and there are windows
Mm.
all the way down. And as the moonlight is shining in through,
Mm.
you get basically dark light, dark light, dark light.
Mm.
And that sort of speaks to the kind of visual storytelling that you associate with Conan Doyle. That immediacy
Mm.
of
It's
description.
filmic.
Yeah, it's filmic, absolutely, and that's a really so you might get the sort of buckets of blood at one end, but you've
Mm.
also got just the hints, the makings of
Mm.
some subtlety in there as well.
Mm. And I mean, these cliches obviously come through to the modern era. I mean, think with the dripping blood. I mean, you've got that in the house that dripped blood, or the hammers, the house that bled to death. All these cliches still come through, but it's using them knowingly.
Yes.
Is the key to it, and I mean, it puts me in mind as well of what we discussed in the episode on the Silver Mirror.
Hmm.
We talk about the Edinburgh Holyrood house. That there's meant to be the
The
blood stain
stain
on
on
the
the
floor
floor.
from the murder of David Rizzio. So yeah, that's probably it's again this very sort of traditional folkloric
Yes. Yeah.
element coming in here.
Yeah.
And later on with this whole idea of the kind of the indelible blood stain, he reused it in his Regency novel Rodney Stone, published in 1896. Where you have young Rodney and his friend Jim Harrison. So again,
Yes.
it's two young men explore their local haunted house, Cliff Royal, which has its own ghost, the Walker of Cliff Royal.
Hmm.
And it's almost like this typical two young men daring each other on to spend a night in the haunted house. And again, this house, there's been a card party there
Yes.
that's gone wrong, and one of the players has ended up cutting his own throat because of losses, and so the story builds up, and then you actually do get very good description of when they hear something. I heard it too. A shuffling footstep in the room above, and then a creak from the steps, and then another creak, and another. I saw Jim's face, as if it had been carved out of ivory, with his parted lips and his staring eyes fixed upon the black square of the stair opening. He still held the light, but his fingers twitched, and with every twitch the shadows sprang from the walls to the ceiling, and still the step came slowly from stair to stair.
Hmm.
It's, yeah, he's really learned his craft by this point. It is almost like he's taking the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe and rewriting it.
Yes. Yeah, very much so. Even later, he's sort of still playing with some of the themes in Haunted Grange, also Bully of Brooker's Court later.
Mm.
A similar kind of thing about a ghost being pursued by their victim.
It seems quite an original element to have one ghost chased by another
Yes,
ghost
it does. Yeah.
and being terrified of you. You do get this again in a very strange form in the Bully of Brooker's Court.
Yeah, very.
But you don't get this much. I mean, the only modern example I could think of is John Boyne's This House is Haunted,
Yes.
which has two fighting spirits, and it doesn't work. It's got to be handled where even Boyne cannot get it right, and it's again that fall into what feels like parody.
Yes.
It's very very easy to do, and Doyle actually does, and particularly in Bully of Brocker's Court, it's handled brilliantly.
Yeah, it's very, very well done. Yeah. And as you're talking there about the about Rodney Stone, it's put me in mind of Conan Doyle's own experiences with haunted houses when he was a new member of the Society for Psychical Research. The SPR was actually formed about 10 years earlier than that, around 1882, after a conference was held in London, to foster scientific research into the supernatural and unexplained phenomena, in much the same lines as we've just been talking about with the description in Haunted and the Haunters. But in 1893, Conan Doyle joined the society, and it's interesting to look at when that happened. It was around January 1893, and at that time, Conan Doyle was in Upper Norwood. He was actually the president of the Upper Norwood Literary and Scientific Society, and he presided over a talk from Professor W.F. Barrett of the SPR, and he mentioned some interesting things in his introduction of W.F. Barrett, which were repeated in the local newspaper. In it, Conan Doyle said he and a few friends felt it to be a reproach to science that the inquiry into alleged psychical phenomena should be left to the ignorant and the charlatan. Some of the phenomena certainly seemed trivial and puerile, but not more so than many which exercise the minds of the early fellows of the Royal Society. I mean, it's an amazing statement, isn't it? It's already connecting back to that idea that the supernatural is merely something that is yet to be discovered, yet to be explained. So that was January 1893. He joined the society at the same time, and he then went on to take part in an early sort of haunted house investigation a year later.
Yes, this investigation was one he carried out with two fellow SPR members, Dr. Sidney Scott and Frank Podmore, and it was an Irish family had been supposedly experiencing strange phenomena in their house.
Yeah.
And so the three investigators went over there, spent a couple of nights in Charmouth, set up all the paraphernalia of tripwires, etc. And there's one point where not a lot seemed to happen, and then the son of the house at one point said, "Oh no, you mustn't go yet. You mustn't go yet. Things might happen." And then there was a large bang, and things got a little bit more exciting, but still not, nothing too major happening, but enough to seem interesting. But Podmore was a noted skeptic. He really was. He took the kind of the classic scientific approach to all this. And Doyle, he later became an opponent of Doyle during Doyle's real spiritualist phase. But at the time, at one point there was a maid in the house who was suspected of being behind these phenomena. But then the suspicion turned towards the son, and the report actually did make these suspicions of theirs obvious, and Doyle agreed with Podmore's conclusions on this. Later on, Doyle wrote he wrote an account at the time in a letter to his literary mentor James Payn, which followed these lines. Later on, we get two different accounts from Conan Doyle, one in Memories and Adventures, one in The Edge of the Unknown, both of which are far more leaning towards the side of these were real phenomena.
Yes.
There was something going on here. And then the house burned down, and then in the remains of the garden, a skeleton of a child was dug up. Or again, we're going back to classic sort of cliched material.
It is, absolutely. Yeah.
And I think Podmore was obviously stuck with the original conclusions, and Doyle became more and more scathing.
Yes.
About Podmore's approach. The whole incident ended in acrimony, decades later. But it was Doyle's only experience of the haunted house investigation. But it obviously made a real mark on him.
Yes, I think it did. And you get, it puts me in mind of the another haunted house investigation that he writes up in Land of Mist, where you get John Roxton going into the house. And oddly enough, that similarly has a kind of buckets of blood feel to it, don't they? Because they go upstairs to a bathroom and where somebody had slit their wrists in.
Yes.
Bath, I think, and it's a kind of
a doctor is supposed to have lived in the house, and then it's the I don't know whether it is his actual evil spirit or part of the darker part of his spirit is
Yes,
supposed to be in the house, and so there's Ed Malone, Lord John Roxton, and a mild clergyman
that's right.
go
Yeah,
and investigate it,
yeah.
and Roxton thinks the best way to go about these things is by blasting the hell out of everything. And it's the mild-mannered clergyman, of course, the spiritualist hero,
Yes,
who lays the ghost to rest, and it shows that this is the way to combat evil spirits, is to bring them to the good and lay them
yes.
in that way. But interestingly, I mean, that story itself was based upon another supposed real life haunted house investigation, which was chronicled in Violet Tweedale's Phantoms of the Dawn.
Mm,
And again, you can see where Doyle has taken the elements of that supposed real life
yes,
investigation and worked them into this episode in the Land of Mist. And I mean, when Phantoms of the Dawn came out, Doyle supplied a forward to
yes.
the book, so he was definitely
Well
familiar
aware with it,
with the
yeah.
story. Mm.
And I always think it's fascinating when you look at the description of the evil, malevolent spirit in the Land of Mist. It's very similar to a description of a similar spirit in the middle of The Haunted and the Haunters.
Mm. Mm.
So, yet again, he's channeling that book. I mean,
Mm.
Conan Doyle's relationship with the SBR similarly ended in acrimony decades later, didn't it? I mean,
Mm.
his resignation letter to the SBR survives.
Mm.
I'll put a link to an article about this in the show notes, but essentially, a review had appeared in the SPR journal by a chap called Theodore Besterman that claimed that a series of sittings by an Italian medium were fraudulent, and Conan Doyle believed that the phenomena couldn't be dismissed quite so
Mm.
easily and got very upset with Besterman, not least because Besterman was not present. And Conan Doyle has had this long rumbling with the society about it being increasingly skeptical. And at this point, he wrote quite a fierce resignation letter in which he said that the assertions of the opponents of spiritualism are at once accepted on their face value without the slightest attempt at discriminate examination. My only resource is, after 36 years of patience, to resign my own membership and to make some sort of public protest against the essentially unscientific and biased work of a society
Mm.
which has for a whole generation produced no constructive work of any kind, but has confined its energies to the misrepresentation and hindrance of those who have really worked at the most important problem ever presented to mankind. But again, it's back to that old thing about, scientific method, proof, open mind. We're going back to those same sort of themes that we're seeing explored in the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe. And
Mm.
this was 1930.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it
1935.
was just a month or so before his death when
Yeah,
he resigned.
that's it. That's
Uh,
it. Yeah.
yeah, it's really, I think, quite fascinating the way the haunted house is used, and this kind of the haunted house. The idea of it has never gone out of fashion.
No.
It's again, as we've been discussing constantly. It's how you use these sort of tropes, and you've actually got at the time that Conan Doyle is investigating the haunted house with the SPR.
Mm.
You've also got a number of stories beginning to come through, ghost stories, with fictionalized psychic investigators. I'm thinking of characters like Algernon Blackwood's John Silence,
Mm.
William Hope Hodgson's Carnacki, and Ian H. Heron's Flaxman Lowe. And they all investigate haunted houses. I
Yeah.
mean, particularly Flaxman Lowe, and the Flaxman Lowe stories originally appeared in Pearson's magazine, and they'd even have photographs
Yes.
of the haunted houses to give verisimilitude to the stories. So you get this strange crossover of the fiction and that the kind of the psychic investigator real world
Mm.
is going on at this time. Again, where we talk about Conan Doyle and Frank Podmore. Frank Podmore had actually investigated haunted houses with Algernon Blackwood.
Yes.
And Blackwood's first published ghost story was called The Empty House,
Mm.
and was a reworking of one of his own experiences in investigating a haunted house. So this is all very much in the air
Yeah,
at,
very
at
much so.
the time, and also ghost stories are beginning to become more sophisticated.
Yes.
Again, William Hope Hodgson is doing these investigations in fiction with Carnacki.
Mm.
But he also, in 1908, writes a book called The House on the Borderland,
Yes.
which is a
Yes.
variant on the haunted house story, where a haunted house in Ireland becomes an absolute focus of cosmic horror.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, it's a really fascinating take on it, and like we've discussed with Doyle and his filmic descriptions, and Hope Hodgson does this as well in The House on the Borderland.
Mm.
So you're getting this coming in as well as the growth of, at this time, the psychological ghost story is also coming in, which is almost the antithesis of the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe,
Mm.
where these are the sort of stories where is it all in the narrator's mind, or are the ghosts seen? And I'm thinking particularly, you got this developing actually in the 1860s with people like Charles Dickens with The
Yeah.
Signalman,
Yeah.
and Green Tea by Sheridan Le Fanu.
Yes.
And it's really perfected almost by Henry James in 1898 with The Turn of the Screw.
Yeah.
So all of these things are going on, and again, if you go back and reread The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, you also have to look at it in its time before these
Yes.
sort of stories come into play. So Doyle is looking back at Bulwer Lytton, and more of those the hackneyed cliches, which are not being disposed of with the psychological ghost story, but being reworked in a very,
Yes.
very different way.
Yeah. And as we get close to time on the podcast, I'd just like to circle back on where we started, really, which was the idea of the Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe being a very early piece of work, that probably the first surviving submission to a publication by Conan Doyle. And it's worth, I think, thinking a bit about, who was it that encouraged Conan Doyle to start writing in the first place. In Memories and Adventures, he describes how he was encouraged to submit works by a friend. He says, "Some friend remarked to me that my letters were very vivid, and surely I could write some things to sell." And then he goes on to talk about the mystery of Sasassa Valley. And that's led many people to think that the friend he's referring to there was Rupert Hall Hunter, who was the nephew of the doctor at Aston that he was apprenticed to in the late 1870s. Although there's a bit of an oddity in this idea that, if you were working with somebody on a day-to-day basis, would you be getting vivid letters from them? But another candidate is Willie Burton, who we mentioned earlier. And I think that's a really attractive idea. It ties us back to John Hill Burton and to John Blackwood. And Owen Dudley Edwards was very keen on the idea that Haunted Grange may have been submitted by John Hill Burton to John Blackwood, and that this might also account for the lack of correspondence. That's an attractive idea. But I think the third candidate is really interesting, is Jimmy Ryan. This is James Paul Emile Ryan, who was his one and only friend at Stonyhurst, we're told, was in the year below Conan Doyle, but was another Scot, and actually was said to be of Glasgow and Ceylon. That's because his grandfather had set up a tea plantation. Ryan eventually, in 1910, I think it was, would go on to actually manage the tea plantation in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as we call it now. Ryan is somebody who Conan Doyle corresponded with throughout their lives. Ryan died in 1920, and we actually have some of the letters in the British Library from Jimmy Ryan to Conan Doyle. We don't have Conan Doyle's letters to Ryan, but we do have the ones Conan Doyle received. And they're really interesting because they actually speak to two friends who can talk without any kind of filters because they've known each other for so long. And even though we only have one side of the story, we get lots of nice insights into it. It's clear that Conan Doyle shared story ideas with Jimmy Ryan, because Jimmy Ryan comments on ideas for The Lost World and for The Poison Belt in his letters. Jimmy Ryan was also a classical scholar and a linguist, and so a lot of the material that goes into Tales of Long Ago, Conan Doyle's great collection of historical vignettes, he's bouncing backwards and forwards ideas with Ryan all the time. And I think all of this speaks to the fact that Conan Doyle shared a very special connection to Jimmy Ryan. And I wouldn't be surprised if it was Jimmy who was the one who was the real inspiration, who actually said to Conan Doyle, you should really pick up your pen and start writing. And that's why I think at the end of Haunted Grange, you get this tacit nod to the salon right at the end of that story.
Yeah, I think that definitely sounds right to me, and particularly with the salon reference. You got Tom, Jim. It's this kind of Tom Holton, Jim Ryan. The phonetics,
Yes.
even are not dissimilar. So I would say the others certainly. I would think Willie Burton is playing a role.
Yeah. Oh, completely.
But Ryan is I'm with you on that one. I think is the central character.
Yeah.
In this.
Yeah. I wish we knew more about him, but sadly a very difficult figure to find out information on. So that brings us to the end of this episode. If you want to find the show notes, you can read them at doingsofdoyle.com, and you can also find out there how to become a patron through Patreon or on PayPal. And if you've enjoyed the episode, please leave us a rating or review or a comment on the website. It really helps to raise awareness of the podcast and to invite in new listeners. So, Paul, what are we looking at next time?
Well, we're going to take a slightly different approach here. We're going to carry on the theme of this podcast. We are in the season of ghosts. So we're actually going to be looking at one of Doyle's later stories called Selecting a Ghost, The Ghosts of Goresthorpe Grange, in which he uses the same name, but for very different purpose.
Yeah. So that will be with you next month in time for the holiday season. So until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.
Does seem quite comfortable.
Before you decide.
I've already decided. But to take it.
Oh. In that case, I feel it's only fair to warn you.
Warn me?
The former tenants. There were, tragedies.
Are you trying to tell me that this house is haunted?
Not exactly.